The second perspective is going to be, no, the first was tax justice, the second is on human rights. And for this we have Liliane Mouan. Yes, I have not butchered your name, as mine was. She is an AFRODAD trustee. Beyond AFRODAD, she works as human rights and sustainable development advisor at the East Africa Regional Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. She's previously held key positions within the UN agency and civil society, UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa, and also senior advisor on corruption, or is it against corruption? Against corruption and for human rights at Amnesty International and international economist at OHCHR's Central Africa Regional Office, a lecturer and consultant at leading UK universities. Liliane is going to focus on human rights, and the prompting question for you is, how do we Africanize the date debate, the date issue? Over to you.
Thank you so much. Please allow me to start by thanking the organizers for the kind invitation. Of course, I'm joking because as a trustee of AFRODAD, I should be welcoming you all to this event. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. We know August is busy, but seeing the room full, I signed up today, and that was number 278 on the list, which means that, you know, that demonstrates the interest in this conference. So I will actually touch upon the points, many of the points that the regime made in this presentation, trying to bring in the human rights perspective. So how do we Africanize the debt issue moving forward? For me, and just for your information, I agree with many of the points that were made so far. I just see this session still as a framing session, and so I will just add my voice, a few thoughts, but also a few prompting questions for our consideration throughout the course of the conference. So how do we Africanize the debt issue moving forward? The first thing for me would be by democratizing the debt discourse further. So the human rights framework recommends a multi-pronged approach to reparations and reparatory justice. This encompasses, of course, compensation, rehabilitation to our ecosystems, for example, guarantees of non-repetition, including by reforming those institutions and systems that continue to be used to marginalize and exclude Africa. It encompasses restitution, including of cultural heritage and cultural artifacts, though we discussed that early in the morning. They are not just artifacts. It includes restoration of memory and dignity and affirmation of African agency and narratives. And to me, the restoration of memory and dignity and the affirmation of African narratives is something that has not really been emphasized so far, but they are a crucial part of reparations for debt injustice. And of course, as AFRODAD trustee, I'm proud of the role that AFRODAD is playing in correcting previously had false narratives about Africa's position in the global system, reinforcing narratives about Africa as a net creditor and Africa as a rule maker, not just a rule taker. In my view still, however, we need to democratize this debate further by unpacking further what the debt issue is. And that will enable us to empower African parliaments, regional bodies, civil society platforms to challenge creditor dominance in shaping debt narratives and solutions. We also need to demystify the debt issue because, let's be real, it still remains a highly technical issue, often discussed at higher levels and at the macro level. We do know who holds the real power in global debt relations. We know how debt is used as a tool of control and dependency of post-colonial states. We know how debt negotiations reflect unequal global power dynamics. But what are the implications of these issues and processes for African citizens? What do these things mean concretely for secondary school teachers, university students, for the working poor, for young or women entrepreneurs operating in the informal economy? Last year's protest in Kenya show that there is growing understanding and interest in the implications of debt and austerity measures on people and their livelihoods. We also have the case of Mozambique, of course, but these are two examples of cases that highlight the linkages, strongly highlight the linkages between debt and human rights and development. But we need more of those, and we need to build critical mass to help give visibility to these linkages between debt and everyday struggle. As Dereje mentioned, we also need to, in my view, reclaim, communicate, and amplify African agency. I get a sense listening since this morning that we are saying, let Africa transition from a position of structural subordination to one of agency and leadership. But we were just told, that we do have agency. We have agency at the continental level, at the national level, at the local level. These stories are not just always framed as us shaping, global debate. This is only just starting, but we need to reclaim this narrative, and we need to communicate and amplify those. I think this, to me, is what is missing. So first, democratize the debt issue. Secondly, we need to frame debt as a governance issue, as a human rights issue, as a development issue, and, as we were told this morning, as a security issue. And looking at the governance issue, for example, requires that we interrogate it from a political economy perspective, taking a human right or people-centered approach. And for me, there are key questions that we need to ask, and we are starting to ask those questions. And I'm talking here from a micro perspective, so at the national and local level. So how is debt contracted? How do political elite or national politics shape borrowing decisions? Is the loan agreement subject to parliamentary oversight? What is the debt contracted for? Who benefits from the debt? Whose interest does that debt actually serve? Should that debt be considered illegitimate or odious? Who will pay for the debt and how? We were told, we often hear, numbers in percentages, but here's the case of Mali. The budget of Mali in 2024 was 3,000 billion CFA, or about $5.2 billion. Out of these 3,000 or $5.2, 1,000 billion were used for salaries of civil servants, 1,000 used for debt servicing, 1,000 used for, was shared between defense and security, so 400 billion there, and the rest, only 600 billion was used for health, education, infrastructure combined, meaning that only 20 to 25% of the budget was used for things that actually promote development. So, when we think about this, if, through debt-driven austerity measures, are we actually, what can be the issue actually here is, what can be done, just to simplify it, what can be done about this? How can law, we were told that law was used to subjugate Africa, but how can we use law, and I know Donald is going to come back to it, how can we use law and human rights law and standards, to assess but also to challenge the regressive impact of debt and austerity on people, particularly marginalized community? We need to think about practical steps on how to challenge, how to assess, but also how to challenge these issues. Looking at debt as a development issue, on the other hand, necessitate, as Dereje pointed out, that we dive deeper into the intersectionality between debt and other critical development issues, anchoring or linking this to, of course, the AU Agenda 2063. So linking debt to taxation, linking debt to climate action or climate finance, including the just energy transition, because yes, we do have to fund it. So what do we have to say, for example, on linkages between debt and economic transformation, industrialization, value addition, which are all Agenda 2063's priority areas. We know that servicing, conditionalities, and other regressive measures have diverted resources away from investment in the development of skills, of local industries, low value-added manufacturing, leaving African countries deindustrialized and largely dependent on creditors and imports. The question for us is, how can we reverse this? So how can we use debt, for productive investment, depending on what that means in different contexts? Could debt finance, for example, the type of infrastructure and value chain that could boost regional integration and resource-based industrialization, notably, of course, through the AFCFTA? We're also arguing that reparatory measures, debt cancellation, reparations, and so on, will create the fiscal space that would give African countries sovereignty over their development strategies. However, the question we are not addressing is, how can we be sure that the resources mobilized and this newly created fiscal space will eventually lead to the socio-economic transformation that we are all calling for? And of course, lastly, what are the most viable alternative financing mechanisms or instruments that could be used to reduce our reliance on external debt without compromising development goals or obligations to realize economic and social rights? Could this be through strengthened national development banks? Do we need to revive those? Could this be through regional funds, through progressive taxation, or through debt for nature swaps? This, to me, are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves, and we need to anchor our discussion moving forward. I think, going back to the question on how to Africanize the debt debate, for me, these are a critical question we need to ask, linking this to the AU development agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Awesome. Really appreciated how you want us to make this date issue relatable to students, to workers, even to what they say in Kiswahili, the mama bogas, the ones that are selling vegetables and boiled maize on the road. What does it mean? I hope the note takers are also noting that so far Africa's agency, is it Africa's agency or African agency? But that is something that we can debate, but the affirmation and reaffirmation of that agency has been noted again by the second speaker, really provoking us, do elected elites represent our interest? As you said, who is borrowing how much, what for, and under what conditions? Those are all provoking us. And of course, the necessary trade-off that we're seeing between debt servicing, interest payment, as well as with economic development choices. But again, to also be very careful as Africans, and while we are discussing Africanizing, this concept, this idea, this discourse is, people talk about just transition, but is energy, we need to interrogate, is energy transition happening to begin with? Is it transition or addition that we are seeing? Okay, before we even go to the just element of it, we need to also interrogate, do date nature swap work? Do they? Really? Is there evidence? Is there literature out there? So those are the things that we need to also be very careful when we are Africanizing these discussions.